Hello, everybody, and welcome to another live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, and joining me once again, none other than Game Director Ion Hazzikostas. Ion, thanks so much for doing another one of these.
Pleasure as always. Hey Josh, hey everybody, and time for another fun Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. We got a lot of great questions picked out. We actually have several sort of class-specific questions. I think you wanted to say something about just general class questions in these Q&As
Sure.
at the start of this.
Yeah, so I think people have probably noticed. I mean, the way the whole process works is, there's a million questions submitted on the forums, on Twitter. The community team goes through them and kind of prepares the list of questions for this. Usually in the past, we try to avoid very spec-specific questions for two main reasons. One, the second we start talking in detail about, let's say, Survival Hunter, like 95% of the audience inherently isn't interested in that question. So we try to cover broader topics that are more likely to apply to a larger percentage of the people who are watching, who are listening. But also, I'm not personally a class designer. I'm kind of, I as an individual am overseeing kind of the breadth of the game's content and development. And so I can speak with more competence, I guess, and more direct information to bigger picture systems issues, things along those lines, than getting into the nitty-gritty of a rotational detail. That said, obviously, classes are the hot topic right now. Certainly looking at the 715 PTR forums and elsewhere, there's a ton of discussion around that, and it wouldn't even really be a credible Q&A if we didn't really dig into that. But apologies in advance for anything dumb I might say. I'm, tried to go over forums, talk to the class team as much as possible in advance of this to really make sure I had the latest understanding of our details. Like I know the big picture philosophies, but I don't always know the details of every single spec. So if I happen to say something like hunters still have deterrence, look, guys, it's aspect of the turtle. It's basically the same ability. But no, please forgive me in advance. But without further ado,
all right,
let's get into it.
Let's jump right in. First question here comes from Johan Linderskov, who asked, is the secondary scat, quote-unquote, squish, not going to hurt specs that heavily rely on crit, such as Fire Mage, or mastery, such as Arms Warrior, etc.?
It shouldn't, ultimately. So I think what we've done here, players saw the first part, and again, we didn't do the greatest job of messaging this in advance because we also didn't know exactly when these changes were going to go into the game in terms of which PTR build. They weren't like traditional spell changes. They were changes to the fundamental way items are built. The first step was to reduce the amount of secondary stat that you get per rating. But then the second step that just came up in the PTR build that went out a few days ago was actually increasing the budget of all items across the board. So if you're someone who has like 47% crit, you have a lot of a certain secondary stat, you're actually probably only going down to something like 45% after this change, and you got a bunch of extra int or strength or whatever it was, your overall power shouldn't be meaningfully affected. And obviously, there's going to be more gear coming down the line. So you might end up with a little bit less of what you have. But overall, this change was aimed at shifting the balance of how much of an item's power comes from the secondary stats to help make item level a better, more consistent guide for what you should equip. So I think in general, what we're aiming for coming into 715, pretty much no matter what, I'm sure there'll be occasional exceptions, but for the most part, a 15 eye level upgrade, like a 1-tier upgrade, should be something that you can just blindly equip and trust that that's the right thing to do. Most 10 eye level upgrades will be, and the ones you get lower than that, or if there are things like sockets in play, then it comes down to, maybe you do, if you're a super min-max player, you want to run Sims or look at Pawn or something like that. But by and large, item level should be a much more consistent guide, and this should affect, everybody largely equally, since everybody is benefiting from secondary stats across the board. Had the same reduction. Doesn't matter whether you're focused in one secondary stat or spread evenly between three of them. You just kind of lost around 1 or 2% of your secondary stats.
Right, and you, like you were saying, you sort of made that back up elsewhere through extra primary stats.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I know a lot of people have been very worried about, like, I logged onto PTR a week ago and I lost like 10% crit. So good to hear that that's not the end target, basically.
Yeah, definitely not.
Okay, cool.
And so I think two. This may come up. This may come up later. I think there's a lot of numbers tuning still yet to happen. We kind of offset the item secondary stat rebalancing with item budget increases, but I think there's two main points here. First, overall, we don't want to nerf players. Your entire raid group, when 715 comes out, you should have the same or even slightly easier of a time killing a boss that you could kill comfortably the week before. We don't want to reduce your raid group's DPS as a whole. And second, in terms of your relative standing, none of these changes are really aimed at that. I'm sure there's some who will take issue with this, but overall, we're actually kind of pretty happy with balance on live right now in 7-1 in terms of the overall DPS picture. A couple of specific outliers like extreme Surrender to Madness cases notwithstanding. We didn't go into any of these changes with the goal of nerfing X or buffing Y. It was more about fixing talent weightings, fixing secondary stat values, and making itemization more intuitive.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. We actually have a couple more questions about the secondary rebalance. Let's go ahead and move on to this one. It comes from Artunius DPS, who asked, secondary rebalancing and jewelry changes on PTR encourage stat stacking and getting the item with the right stats even more? Question mark. I guess that probably could have been a period at the end instead of a question mark, but
then it wouldn't have been a question.
Then it would have been a question. Yeah. But how do you feel about the idea of? I've seen some people sort of saying this, like, but you've just done this and then buffed up items, so now we have to do the same thing again.
It's not necessarily intuitive, but I think basically we changed. So one of the things we changed in Legion that contributed to the whole secondary stat problem, eye level problem, is we flattened out. I talked about this a little bit last Q&A. We flattened out the rate at which secondary stats scale over the course of the max level period in the expansion. We wanted to start you out with higher levels of crit and haste as a fresh 110 and not let you get to such extreme levels at the end of the expansion. Right. Whereas in the past, very often, specs would not play very well at very low gear levels and then would end up almost hitting soft caps by the end of by the end of an expansion.
Like a Fire Mage with 10% crit just felt really
exactly
bad before.
Yeah. And so on regular, like on chest pieces, on helms, on other items, that works. The way that works out is that the higher eye level you get, the larger share of an item's budget comes from primary stat. That more of the power goes into primary, less goes into secondary as the expansion goes on, and that's kind of how that accomplishes itself. However, on jewelry, there is no primary for it to go into. So what that actually meant was, and this was frankly a bug in some cases. I mean, at the very least, an oversight on our part. Jewelry scaled less well than every other item slot. In general, if you get a helm that's 20 eye levels higher than your previous helm, it should have around 20% more stats. But if you got a ring that was 20 eye levels higher than your previous ring, it might only have like 12% more stats because of the way secondary stats scaled. And so what that meant was that what mattered much more than item level in most cases was whether it had the quote-unquote right secondary stats for you or not. The fact that they scale normally now the way they used to in past expansions means that when you're looking at a much higher eye level ring or neck, okay, you still want your best stat. That's not going to change. Your best stat is your best stat. You may seek it out. But when you're looking at a 20, 30 eye level higher ring, rather than just a few rating points difference, you're actually giving up like 200 or 300 rating if you use the lower eye level ring. And along with hopefully narrowing the gaps between extreme cases and secondary stat weights, that should make it much more likely and much more consistently the case that you want to just wear the higher item level item when there's large margins.
So basically, I guess to TLDR, there's a lot of math, but the way it works out is good.
Basically, basically, yes. I think if people feel otherwise, we're all welcome to, open to, would love to hear math to the contrary. If people are running sims, whatever, in 715 and going through your theory crafting spreadsheets and you're coming to the conclusion that's different from ours, let us know. Our goal, like I said, really is for like a tier up gear. If you have a normal raid piece and you kill a heroic raid boss, you should just be able to equip that piece that's 15 plus eye levels higher without really worrying about whether or not you're doing the right thing. It should be the right thing.
Okay, cool. Similar question here from Dosvi, who asked, what is being done to ensure tanks want eye level upgrades since primary stats mean far less to them?
Yeah, so I think primary stats for the most part give you avoidance, which doesn't have a huge value in small quantities for tanks. We understand that. In the longer run, there's probably more we can do to make primary stats have some more direct mitigation value for tanks. In the meantime, what we've done with items has reduced the amount of budget that goes into secondaries in each individual item. You do get more stamina and more armor as a result of our changes, and armor especially, as well as just general health pool, do have value to tanks, along with, we've been trying to look at the values of secondary stats and make sure there aren't extreme outliers. I know in a couple of cases for tanks there still are. So the answer here is kind of much the same as for other classes. It's just that the power lies not in strength, but in the other properties of the item, and it's something we're still working towards.
Yeah, that's a good thing to call out, as well as specifically that the stamina will increase on items as a result of this too. It's not just that the agility or the strength is going up; it's also your health pool gets
exactly
bigger.
What we basically said was, we changed the rating conversion, but then we just kind of buffed items across the board by around 5%.
Okay.
So what that means is an 825 item in 715 is as strong as an 830 item is today in terms of the raw like stamina, strength, amount, the numbers on it.
Okay.
And that carries all the way across the board. So your 890 today is going to be like an 895 and 715 and so forth. So that's where a lot of the power is coming from.
Okay, cool. Next question here from Kirvek, and this I believe is where we start getting into our more class-focused questions. He asked, or she asked, what is the reason for the large mechanical changes that are slated for 715? As it stands, a lot of classes are going to feel drastic changes on the order of what they felt moving from Warlords of Draenor to Legion. So kind of asking, in the past, we've sort of kept a lot of the sort of changes that are happening in 715 for something like an expansion. What's made us not want to wait on these changes, I guess?
I guess I would question a couple of the premises here. I don't know that it's a lot of classes, and I don't know that the changes are quite as drastic as, completely changing all of your core rotational abilities or your entire resource model. Like, there were very fundamental reworks in Legion in the 7.0 patch. And the reality is the reason why we're doing this in 715 is because of how sweeping and how drastic a lot of those changes were in the first place in Legion. Some classes are almost practically new classes. They were stripped down to their foundations and rebuilt around kind of the essence of what that class represents in terms of fantasy, in terms of gameplay, in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And there's no question that when we undertake that type of project, we're going to get some things wrong. In some cases, we're going to get more than a few things wrong. And when the alternative is, well, if there are things that aren't satisfactory, do we just leave them until the next expansion? I don't think that's right. I think internally we have thought of these patches as almost ripples. It's if there's think of a lake or a pond or something that is, this is getting very metaphorical here, but is WoW classes. We just dropped a giant boulder in that lake. And that was Legion, right?
Yeah.
It was very disruptive. It changed a ton of things. And there's going to be these ripples that go out. And they'll get progressively smaller. I think, so 715 is our first crack at this. Future patches, we're going to continue iterating and refining. And then there'll be a point later on in the expansion where we say, okay, we're not going to make any drastic changes at this point. Those will wait till the next expansion. But it feels like the right thing for our players is to try to solve problems now rather than kicking the can down the road.
Better to fix the issues now than just sort of let it ride for the whole expansion where possible. And obviously, like you said, there were a lot of very drastic changes going from Warlords and Elite, like survival becoming a melee spec, discipline becoming whatever we technically classify discipline as these days.
Yeah.
So
combat becoming outlaw.
Yeah, exactly.
Warlock resource changes, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah. Speaking of warlocks, here's a question from I believe that's Ilkoland, who asked, long-term plans for warlocks. Numbers aren't terrible, but none of the specs feel fun to play. And that's an interesting one. Like, a lot of times we see feedback where it's like, well, my class isn't good, and we look at the numbers and we say, well, no, you're fine, and the issue is that they're just not necessarily enjoying the way it plays. So what's our long-term plan for warlocks here?
Yeah, so obviously sorry to hear that. I think, overall, warlocks, having listened to a lot of feedback, and a lot of this was continuing through beta and continues today, there's a couple of issues I think that hinder each spec that we are on our radar and that we are thinking through ideas for how to solve. Affliction, they've gotten a number of numerical and some mechanical improvements in 715. We definitely hear a lot of feedback on the soul effigy talent in particular. A lot of that is a similar feedback to what we used to hear about prismatic crystal from mages in Warlords a lot of the time, just about the awkwardness of having to interact with it. The idea behind that talent is you, as a dot class, you excel at multi-dotting. And so, well, if you're fighting patchwork or if you're fighting a single target, you can make it so that you always are effectively multi-dotting and getting the efficiency of doing that. We've, I think, made some improvements to 715 so that you can only target your own soul effigy, and that makes it easier to more consistently tab to and things like that. So hopefully it can feel in practice more like just a standard council fight where you're just trying to keep your dots up on two targets and doing so effectively. And obviously other options in that row should also be strengthened such that they feel like reasonable alternatives if you don't like that gameplay. A couple of the more challenging problems to solve are on the other specs. I know that demonology, demonic empowerment is definitely a source of frustration. The feeling that there's so much ramp time, you're spending so much time as a demonology lock, getting your resources, using those resources to get your army of pets out, and then you just have to manage demonic empowerment, and it feels like you're constantly trying to keep multiple balls in the air, juggling, and a lot of the fun can get lost in that mess. Again, we have this and the Destro lock problem I'm about to talk about in a second are large problems. They're not quick, like, oh, let's just change some numbers or let's change the way this little thing works with a small tweak. We need to definitely think through how the rotation flows. And that's the type of problem that requires both, obviously internal brainstorming, but requires iteration. It requires us to go through multiple cycles on a PTR build, try out different approaches, see how they play, get feedback, respond to them, and so forth. And the reality of our PTR cycles, and this will apply to some other things, other classes concerns that might come up later. As we talked about at BlizzCon, part of the point of these 7.15, 7.25 type patches is we actually want to really make sure that we're getting them out, like around 10 weeks after our last big patch. And whatever we can fit into that patch is what will fit in, and what we can't fit in will table until the next cycle. And that means, for the class team, there's some choice, and there has to be some choice of what gets focused on first and what is tackled later on. And so I think, Shadow Priests and a couple of other classes got a lot of that attention this time around. The Warlock and the Warlock issues, as fundamental as they may be to the specs, I think are something we want to fix during the expansion. It's not going to be something you have to wait until 8.04, but they weren't something that we felt we could fit into this development cycle, especially with a lot of the holidays coming up and various other distractions going on. It makes for a tricky time. I know that's not a satisfying answer, right? If you're a Warlock, I get that you wish, you want improvements and you want them now, and I don't blame you for wanting them now. We all should and we all would, but the reality is with 36 specs, not everyone can be first on our list of priorities all the time. The last issue, Destro locks, I think I talked about this briefly on the forums, I think last week. We wanted in Legion to consolidate Warlocks to use a single, more consistent resource type. And rather than having 3 entirely different resource models for a single class, which was kind of unwieldy and caused a lot of under-the-hood problems. But there was definitely something lost in the granularity of embers, and the ability to generate partial embers with things like Immolate Ticks, with Incinerate, versus relying on a chance to proc a full one. The answer there, and it's going to require some UI support and some redesign, but it's something we want to try to do in a later patch, is pretty much to let Destro Soul Shards behave like embers used to have the idea of partial Soul Shard recharges, so you're actually filling them up and then spending them as wholes the way you used to deal with embers. Pretty much reskin embers and just call them Soul Shards. But I think the rotation flowed better that way. And definitely, so I think there's certainly a version of Destro that can work with singular chunky Soul Shards that don't have, that granularity. But it's a very different. We basically have to rebuild a very different spec than the one that a lot of Warlock players knew and loved throughout Mists and Warlords. And when there's a proven solution that works, we're better off going back to that.
Okay, cool. That sounds good. Yeah, I know. That was a big deal for me personally. Like I played Destruction Warlock throughout Mists and through a fair portion of Warlords as well, and so I was like, this isn't really the same spec anymore. So that's good to hear.
And I think we try with a lot of especially pure DPS classes. We want to vary both, the flavor of your abilities, but we also want to offer different mechanical feels in terms of rotation. Like, do you like proc-driven gameplay, or do you prefer, resource management and keeping uptimes on buffs or debuffs, or do you want, proc-driven reactive stuff? Do you want static predictable? So that there's something for as many playstyles as possible within a given class.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. Next question here comes from... Sorry, I was getting a whole bunch of messages there for a second. I was like, oh God, is the stream broken? But fortunately, it seems like we're fine. Let's move on to this next question from FPT Center, who said, can Havoc have a viable DPS build that does not use Fell Rush or Vengeful Retreat as rotational abilities, so kind of that momentum build?
Yes, I think definitely. I think we've made talent tweaks to things like Fel Barrage. We're trying to kind of break some of the synergies that all push towards that momentum build. I think we want to preserve it as a totally viable build because there's plenty of people who love that dynamic gameplay. It certainly feels like one of the most uniquely Demon Hunter-y things in WoW, just in terms of the extreme degree of movement and the way you're leveraging it. At the same time, when it's getting you killed or you're like fell rushing off the edge into the maelstrom fighting Cenarius, you're not necessarily a huge fan of having that as something you're shackled to, or just you don't like juggling that uptime. That's totally valid, and we want to make sure there's at least a couple of viable builds there, and that's going to come down to numbers tuning, but it's definitely a goal, something we think is an accomplishable goal for 715. When all is said and done and the dust settles, you shouldn't feel locked into momentum if you don't like momentum.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to, sorry, just making sure we're all good here. I think it's interesting as well to look at the idea of what do you call a viable DPS build? Just because so many times in the past we'll see like, okay, so say momentum is the best DPS build for Havoc, then that is now the viable DPS build. And if the other one does 10 less DPS, it's still considered inviable to a lot of players. So there's kind of a balance there, I think, of at what point is it acceptable, and maybe 10 is still the answer, but at what point is it acceptable for a build to do slightly less damage but have a different play style that you enjoy more personally? And that happens between specs as well.
Exactly. It's enjoyment, or that you're just going to actually execute better. I think many people, Sims and maybe world-class players, if you're looking at, methods, Serenity, etc., people may execute the highest skill rotations perfectly, but oftentimes what might be given, put out in guides as kind of the default best choice only is the best choice if you play it perfectly, whereas for even very good players doing mythic content, other options that can be executed more consistently are actually going to yield better results. I think there's a great tool that I would really encourage. I think the picture of talent diversity, it's been really interesting digging into talent diversity as we've made tweaks in Legion. And the talents recommended by guides across sites, even very good guides, often paint an incomplete picture of the amount of diversity that exists or is possible. I think a great tool that the community has provided that gives some insight into this is actually Warcraft logs from a rating perspective. You can filter parses, at any given tier of difficulty or type of content by talent selection. And often you can look at high-end mythic fights and you will see really diverse talent selections in rows that a popular class guide might say there's only one option in. And clearly people are proving that they can be very effective, but a lot of the time you can be hesitant to experiment when it feels like your performance is being judged. You're just going to go with the safe option rather than deal with your raid leader asking you like, wait, why aren't you spec X?
Yeah.
Everyone says that you're supposed to spec X for this fight. But I think, in general, try things out is all I can say.
Cool. Yeah, I've actually used Warcraft logs a lot to compare myself, not necessarily to what the top end raiders are doing, because I'm never going to be as good as those guys. I actually find other people that have similar progression to my own, or are playing a similar build to my own, and oftentimes I'll be able to look and say, okay, this guy has the same build, he's doing 50k more DPS than me. I'm doing something wrong here, and so then I go and I spend some time on a target dummy.
You can filter by eye level. And I think in general, a trap to also avoid for most people is a lot of people go and look at like the 99th percentile or literally like the top 20 parses on a fight. And what you're often seeing there is you're seeing people who by definition got the very best luck, the very best crit chance, proc chance, everything on that given attempt. And also often people who are doing some cheesy things to really maximize their DPS because they're trying to rank that high. But it can often be better to just look at the guild level, look at guilds at a comparable level of progression or even higher than yours, and just look at their rosters and what they're doing.
Okay. Cool. Next question here from Friske, and we talked a little bit about this on the forums yesterday, but I think it's still worth pointing out. Who asked, the Emerald Dreamcatcher nerf only helps lessen the pain between balanced druids, but it also removes the possibility of balanced druids being competitive in single target. What are we gaining single target to make up for this nerf? So what we kind of talked about on the forums yesterday is we're actually going to go in a different direction entirely with the Emerald Dreamcatcher balancing.
But we're still nerfing it.
We're still nerfing it, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was talking to some of the people yesterday, and the number that we've got on it right now may still change, or the number that we're targeting on that may still change. But looking more at the idea of when a legendary is what makes a spec competitive in single target or competitive in a certain area, I think that's kind of interesting here. So how do you feel about that in this case with the Moonkins?
Overall, I mean, it's okay. So overall, this is part of what we're working towards in terms of narrowing the gap between legendaries on the high and low end. If you feel anytime we do this, we will compensate. Like
Right.
and feel free to take us to task if we fail to do that, because it's something we should be doing. If you feel like your spec is only viable if you have a specific item, that's a problem. That item is almost certainly too good. What we should do is nerf that item a bit and then buff the entire spec across the board to compensate, with the net change that the person who had the item is unchanged. Their position has not moved at all. Everyone who doesn't have the item has moved up. So if you're a druid, if you're a balanced druid who has the Dreamcatcher, the end result of all of this, when 715 comes out, and again, we haven't done our final numerical class tuning because it makes sense. We want to iterate on design changes rather than do a tuning pass and then actually mechanics change. We have to retune anyway. It doesn't make sense to do that multiple times. It makes sense to leave it to the end. But the end result should be, if you have the Dreamcatcher, your actual throughput should be unchanged. If you don't, your throughput will end up going up. This should be net neutral to positive for everybody. And the same thing should hold for other, significantly powerful legendaries like the Unholy Bracers or, so on and so forth.
Okay, cool. It may be worth noting as well that tuning is obviously a continual process. It's not like it may have been like 6 or 7 years ago where a patch came out and that was the changes that you got and then it was going to stay there. So if even in the cases where we don't necessarily make that target right away, that's something we can continue to adjust for.
Yes, definitely.
Cool. Question here from Khalade92, who asked, why is there not a single piece from Warriors Tier 19 set with Haste and Mastery? It's the best 2 stats for Fury and Arms.
So I think this question was probably asked before the latest PTR build went up.
Yep.
We took a large restatting pass on all the Nighthold set pieces in Tier 19. I'm pretty sure there is at least one Warrior piece now that has Haste Mastery. That said, we've historically itemized our set pieces with a lot of the same mix of secondary stats as all of our regular gear. We don't set out to make the true ultimate items for everybody that just have nothing but the repeated best stat combos for you. But I think we try to certainly cover at least some of the ones that you want. And with 6 set pieces now making up the set, since we've added cloaks to the Tier 19 sets, you'll have more options to pick the 4 that you want for your set bonus. So that should be, something you can work with depending on what drops for you.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting as well. Like that's always been one of the more interesting part of the tier. Like if a tier set came out and it was literally just equip these 5 items or 8 items back in Classic, equip these items, and then you're done. You have that. Then like that's not quite as interesting to me as, okay, here's this set bonus, and I might want this set bonus. I probably want this set bonus, but which item? Because obviously there's 5 items in a set.
Well, 6 now.
Or 6 items in the set, yeah, but it's still a 4.
Yes,
I haven't
exactly.
imagined this, right? It's still 4 piece.
It's 2 and 4 piece. The point of the 6th item is to give you more flexibility in combinations, especially with legendaries, right? If you have a legendary helm or something, well, you're not going to wear your set helm.
Yeah, that's true.
You want to make sure you still have some choice.
Yeah. And so then thinking about with the remaining pieces in that example, like which ones do I want to equip? Which is losing this much mastery worth picking up this set bonus and so on? I actually think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and the answer generally is yes. I mean, generally you should want your 2 and 4 piece bonuses, but then you may want to reshift your items around once you get a different set piece. That may be the sort of best set of 4 items for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like it. Question here from Exotath, who asked, Unholy Death Knights rely heavily on RNG and to some degree the right legendary to do competitive DPS. Current PTR changes do not seem to address these issues. Are there any plans to improve upon the systems in Unholy?
Okay, so, I mean, I think the legendary, the Bracers in particular, which are one of the strongest legendaries out there, that kind of falls under the same category as the Moonkin Helm that we just discussed. In terms of randomness, this is probably, I imagine, mostly talking about festering wounds and the range of 2 to 4 on that. Since I think the other core random mechanics in Unholy are Runic Corruption and Sudden Doom, both of which have been around since Cataclysm, roughly. So if you're, if that's something that is bothering you, well, that's kind of just been a core part of the class since then. Festering variants, that's definitely something that's on our radar. I feel like a lot of it, and my impression from reading a lot of the community feedback on this, is that a lot of it is tied specifically to the Apocalypse Unholy Artifact active, which requires 8. I mean, it doesn't require, but it summons a ghoul for every wound that's on your target, and you really want to have 8. So rather than, for the rest of your gameplay, you can kind of play in this middle ground of like 3 to 5 wounds, and in that world, just the law of large numbers will play out, and the variance won't be very large from attempt to attempt. On average, you're gonna get 3 wounds per festering over the course of dozens of festerings. There's no question that it can feel bad when you need to go all the way to 8, or you've just been at 8, spent down to 0, and then you get a bunch of 2 wound festerings in a row.
Right.
So I think so. There's a couple of ways we could approach this. The reason for the variability in the number of festering wounds is just to create some mechanical variation in your rotation, so it's not like a strict mechanical cast sequence of festering to apply a fixed number of scourges to remove them, but there's some decision making going on as the fight progresses. One suggestion we've seen from the community that we like is reducing the number and capping the number of wounds consumed by Apocalypse at 4, and having each one summon 2 ghouls instead, so that you would never need to go to 8. So that it would just be a matter of, just make sure that you have a decent number of festerings up when Apocalypse comes off cooldown, use it freely, and go back to your rotation, rather than the current window where you can feel victim to bad RNG. If there's other issues that I'm overlooking, would definitely love to hear more from the Unholy community on that. But that's kind of where we stand, I think.
Okay. Great. And we will obviously keep an eye out for additional feedback on that as well. Question here from, I don't know if I should pronounce this as Cs or as CYZ, but they asked, are there any plans on lowering the RNG of Roll the Bones? I know we've talked about Roll the Bones a lot in the past, but this is still an issue that a lot of Outlaw Rogues are asking about, is you get that 6 buff, and that feels really, really good, and then you get a 1 buff, and you go, why am I even here?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes depends on what it is, sure. But yeah, I think no, we're not going to lower the RNG of an ability that is fundamentally themed around rolling dice. Sure. I mean, I think that is something that is signature to Outlaw. The slice and dice talent, which I feel has kind of been lackluster in a lot of ways, that's something we want to continue improving. We really want a compelling talent option in that row if you don't want that gameplay, right? I think there are people who enjoy the overall ebb and flow of Roll the Bones, some of the mechanical min-maxing of when to re-roll and when not to, but also are okay with the occasional lows of 1 buff streaks because it's worth it for that crazy high when you get that 6 buff at the right time and nothing can stop you. But if you don't like that gameplay, if you want to opt out of it, but you like the rest of Outlaw, Slice and Dice should be the thing that's there for you. And I think the current design maybe just hasn't felt strong enough. There's probably more we can do there to, add more haste to it or something along those lines, so it feels powerful enough and mechanically impactful enough that it's worth giving up Roll the Bones for. But I think that's kind of where we stand. Okay,
cool. Yeah, and it's worth mentioning as well that any sort of environment in which we were to reduce the chance of getting those less exciting Roll the Bones buffs would then immediately mean we'd have to reduce the effectiveness of getting the max level Roll the Bones
in some
buffs.
form, right? Or, I mean, yes, exactly. If you Roll the Bones would be ridiculously strong and overpowered if you could never get 1 buffs.
So I think that approach makes a lot of sense then that you were describing, where it's like, okay, if you want to be able to have those big variances, then that's there, and that's sort of the core thematic approach to Outlaw. But if you want something slice and dice-esque that fits into that category of, okay, you know what, I'm tired of rolling dice, I would just want to be consistent, then making sure that we have an option like that available is sensible. All right, question here from Divinity, who asked, why is Greater Blessing of Might a thing? This ability has been met with nearly universal disdain by Rets since its first appearance in Alpha. It's definitely one that I've seen a lot of feedback on, and I know we've talked about a lot in the past. So what are our thoughts on Greater Blessings for Retribution?
Honestly, I think it's kind of a failed design. So you guys are right. Uh, the the thought here was to capture some of that hybrid element, some of the roots of the shaman class and the paladin class, with some things like Stormlash back in the day, or the
Right.
blessings here. But at the same time, we were very nervous about balance, and I think we just ended up in a place that was the worst of both worlds. I think one of the things we struggle with, if we want to make a buff, a class that has powerful throughput buffs that they can provide to others, well, how much damage do you get to do on your own? If you're actually making someone better by being there in a meaningful way, you're actually adding to their damage, then can you do the same amount of damage as a pure? If the answer there is no, then that's not something a lot of people might want to sign up for. If the answer is yes, then you're just better. Then it's just, well, why would I bring the rogue when I can bring the paladin who does the same damage as the rogue, but also buffs somebody else's damage?
Yeah.
And so we went down the road of like, well, let's try to credit the contribution of the paladin to the paladin so that it shows up on damage meters. And where that ends up landing is this weird, not great place where the warrior isn't happy that there's a rep paladin in the group and they get Blessing of Might because they don't get credited for Blessing of Might's damage. It's more like they have this parasite on them, like Abathur style or whatever. And that's not making them happy. And the rep paladin is sitting there grumbling about the fact that, up to 10% of their damage is dependent on others in the group and not within their control. Neither of those feels really good.
Yeah. If this warrior was better, then I'd be doing more damage, etc. sort of feeling.
Yeah, so I think this is something despite everything I just said, as critical as it is, we haven't come up with a great replacement design in the 7.15 timeframe. It's something we're still discussing. It's something we want to scrap and replace with a better design. So, apologies, but it's something we're working on.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear at the very least. Question here from, I think this is pronounced Mad Into Head, which is appropriate for the question. Who asked, these quote-unquote robust alternatives to Surrender to Madness that you said would come after 7.1. Not seeing them in 7.15 either. When? So obviously that max level talent row for Shadow Priest, where Surrender to Madness is. That's been a very contentious talent row.
This is tough,
for a
exactly. I mean, we recently made... I know you recently had a large post in the Shadow Priest thread on the PTR forums. So I think
they really liked it, by the way. They really liked when I said 18 seconds. That was their favorite part.
Well, so that's actually fun. So I think there was some misunderstanding there separately. So clearly reduced insanity drain during the first 18 seconds of Void Form is in no way, shape, or form. It's not helping the low skill Surrender player. Obviously, in Surrender, the first 18 seconds are a non-thing.
Yeah.
But it does make regular Void Forms a bit more potent. And sort of doing that by comparison actually reduces the relative benefit of Surrender in terms of an exceptionally long Void Form. When your regular Void Forms are a bit longer on average than Surrender, and especially, that curve is something that we may tweak in terms of reducing the length of optimally executed Surrender uptimes. To change the relative marginal benefit that you get from a Surrender Void Form over a regular Void Form. Now, all of that said, Surrender's a conundrum. It's tough, and players in the community have identified this as well. I think it's really iconic. It's really flavorful. It's definitely one of the cooler talents in the game because of how bold and crazy it is. It's one of those tooltips that everyone sees for the first time. They're like, literally you die? Okay. But yeah, that makes it tough to balance. I think where we can hope to land with this, I don't think we can ever come up with a world where, in the hands of a very skilled player, Surrender is not worth using on Ursoc. If there's a talent in that row that's better than Surrender on a 4-minute fight that's just like single target, patchwork style, then Surrender is worthless. There's no world in which it's worth that sacrifice, that risk. That moment of misplaying, that moment of oops, you missed a cast and you're dead. But on a 10-minute fight, it's a very different story. And so I think what we want to try to do, and I think we can still keep buffing Legacy a bit. Mind Spike has been more challenging in terms of just the overall design of it, as we mentioned on the forums. Yeah. So we're not quite there yet. I think our goal is robust alternatives, but we know that we're not quite there yet. I think our goal is to get to a place where there are talents that feel like they're genuinely better in a long fight where you're not going to get the maximum use out of surrender, or where the mechanics of the fight makes surrender kind of prohibitive. Since obviously, in that final burn phase, if there's any point where there's nothing for you to attack, you're just going to die. And then there'll be some tipping point where, in longer fights, other talents are all around better. And then in the average mid-range fight, it comes down to your own personal preference and playstyle. And then, yeah, on Ursoc, you probably should take surrender. And that's fine. And situational talents like that exist on many other classes. We're not quite there yet, but that's our goal.
Okay, cool. And that's something we're doing. We're trying to do a lot more of, is speaking to intent and speaking to goals, which does naturally then mean that a lot of times we'll say this is where we want to get, but we don't necessarily know exactly how we're going to get there just yet. We don't necessarily know when we're going to get there just yet. So I guess just kind of what I'm saying is sort of expect situations like this one to come up from time to time, where it's like, this is what we want, but we're just
and I recognize it's not satisfying, but hopefully it's a more satisfying answer than we disagree with you, we think everything's perfect, you're wrong. Right? That's not what we're saying at all. But yes.
All right. Question here from Andreas, who asked, any word on fixing the many issues with Storm, Earth, and Fire? Very frustrating when our main cooldown can be a DPS loss. So there's been actually a really good thread for monks that's been floating around.
Yeah, on the EU forums.
Yeah. That's we've been reading that a lot and talking about that a lot. Where do we stand on the bug reports and the bug fixes with Storm, Earth, and Fire?
So there's a number of mechanical issues that are holding Storm, Earth, and Fire back from its optimal performance. We are working on getting those fixed. Some of them are fairly complicated. We want to try to get them fixed for 7.1.5. If we're not able to do so, what we'll do is tune Storm, Earth, and Fire around those bugs and buff it as needed until those can be fixed. Definitely don't want it to be DPS loss. Definitely don't want it to feel like if you don't take Serenity, you're stuck with something that's actually a hindrance. Separately, we're also looking into the cooldown interactions on Serenity. I think there was a change made recently where going into Serenity, halved any cooldowns that were previously running, so that you didn't have to worry about having all your cooldowns ready when you push the button. It was always intended, I think, that there was the symmetrical behavior on the tail end, and so there was just a bug fix that went in that was like, hey, it doesn't behave this way in terms of unextending your or uncompressing your cooldowns when Serenity fades. Obviously, if you were in the habit of lining up your cooldowns perfectly, that can be a DPS loss for you. Our intent wasn't necessarily to nerf Serenity, but to make the behavior consistent. So we'll take a look at both the behavior there, whether we need to buff Serenity or what needs to be done to offset that. Regardless, I think we recognize the general concern with that row and the relative weighting of Storm, Earth, and Fire and Serenity, and there's plenty of tuning to be done there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and the idea of, if necessary, if we can look at and say, okay, we can't fix the bug where sometimes you don't get all the ticks of Fist of Fury, for example, we can just make the Storm, Earth, and Fire clones do more damage, and then that kind of just deals with that directly. All right. Question here from Maidarumi, who asked, can you once and for all remove Rune of Power? This ability has been a huge burden for the past 3 expansions, and it's still here, and it's still mandatory for raiding. Rune of Power, every mage's favorite talent. How do we feel about that?
Yeah, it's controversial. I definitely understand the concern. I think it's unfortunate that it is, and so some of this is just tuning. Honestly, I think if things like mirror images and others were better alternatives, that would be in a better place. I think Rune of Power is meant to be a situational talent. It's meant to be a talent that when you're not going to have to move a ton in a fight, if you have the freedom to do that, or you're willing to play around it, you can take and be effective with. If there's a very high movement fight, you probably shouldn't take it. But too often, it ends up being the right answer in all situations. Then you just have to deal with the frustration of every time you get targeted by something, every time some patch of area denial gets dropped on top of your Rune of Power, it feels like the game is messing with you in a bad way. So I think it's a mix of tuning. There's definitely an open question of the underlying design of the ability, whether it might be better served as a more focused cooldown with a shorter duration, so that it's less about tethering yourself to a spot for the entire fight and needing to constantly replace it before you do anything, versus finding a window where you feel confident that you can be stationary and then getting the maximum benefit out of it that way. I think in the short term, we're going to look at tuning the row to make other options more competitive if you either don't like the gameplay or you're in a situation that doesn't suit the gameplay very well. In the longer run, we may look at Rune of Power itself and how it fits in.
Okay, cool. Yeah, even something like increasing the damage that mirror images do, like you were saying,
Totally.
could help a lot there.
Yes, it's not meant to be the all-purpose
Right.
take this in every situation talent.
Okay. Question from Scythar, who asked, is there a possibility for Holy Paladins to get more AoE or heal over time healing spells? Single target based healing often feels clumsy, especially in raids. So Holy Paladin's always sort of been like the big single target bomb healer, but what about giving them a few more tools in that regard?
In this case, I think the answer is honestly no.
Hmm.
I think if you want heal over time healing spells, then you should play a Resto Druid or a Mistweaver. I think, strong single target throughput is kind of one of the signatures of the Holy Paladin. I think overall, and we don't want to water that down or dilute that really. I think overall we're happy with healer balance right now. We're seeing great diversity and representation, comparable numbers, comparable throughput. Even at the very high end, we're seeing diverse raid compositions, and Holy Paladins are doing very well in all types of content. So I think recognize when you're part of especially in a raid or battleground situation, you're part of a team of healers. You can play to your strengths and let them play to theirs. But even in dungeons, I think without that many targets to keep track of, the single target healing still gets the job done quite adequately.
All right, cool. Yeah, and I to me, it's kind of interesting looking at how healers have sort of changed over the years. Because I remember back, even in like the Cataclysm days, but obviously back in Wrath, this was really notable. Is you brought like the Holy Paladin, and maybe like a Discipline or a Holy Priest or something, and those were your single target tank healers. And then you had like the Resto Druid, the Resto Shaman, and those were your raid healers. And we kind of don't do that anymore nowadays. It's kind of like, well, you have healers, and they all just kind of heal. So to me personally, I think it's still interesting that there are those sort of advantages and disadvantages in certain cases.
Agreed.
All right. Question here from Lazy Guide, who asked, Marksman is seen as the top rating spec for hunters currently. Many hunters are unhappy with the vulnerable mechanic and with the immobility of the spec due to aimed shot. Are you overall happy with how Marksman has turned out?
Honestly, mostly yes, I think.
Okay.
I think we rolled back the Sidewinders change. There's still a reliable way of applying vulnerable. In terms of mobility, I think some of that is just the theming, the idea of aimed shot itself. It is taking a moment, gathering yourself, and lining up your shot and taking it. And that's meant to be a trade-off. Beastmaster Hunter is much more mobile than Marks, but Marks has advantages that offset that, particularly in terms of their spread AoE, the effectiveness of things like Barrage, their overall toolkit there, and those are some of the strengths and weaknesses of that spec versus others. And I think there's some tuning to be done to make people feel like other specs like Beastmaster and Survival are more viable in a wider variety of situations and competitive in a variety of situations, and that's something we're working towards from a tuning perspective. But I think we don't have any major concerns with Marks currently.
Okay, cool. Moving on then. Next question from Penny Rush. I think we made it through the class-specific questions at this point, so we're going to move on to some other questions that aren't as class-specific in the time that we have left. This one comes from Penny Rush, like I said, who said, do you have any plans to stop players from hoarding artifact power at level 35 till 7.2? So this is something that I've been seeing a lot in the community. We've talked about it a little bit, but it's a good one to hammer home. Like you really shouldn't just sit at level 35.
Don't do that. Our current plan, this may change, but our current plan, regardless of where we land on the final design, will be a system that does not reward this in any way. Our current thought is that when you further empower your artifact in 7.2 and unlock the additional traits, what it's actually going to do is transform your current 20-point final trait into the new stuff. And that may automatically apply. It may refund the artifact power that you put into that. But literally all you're doing by hoarding your artifact power for the next, however many months is denying yourself power in the short term. You'll end up in the exact same place when you get that upgrade in 7.2. That said, obviously, once you hit your 35 points, there's significant diminishing returns in power after that. It's a great time to level up off-spec artifacts and round out your other artifacts if that's something you're interested in doing. But beyond that, there should never be any reason to just sit an artifact power unspent, and we'll make sure that's the case for the rest of the expansion.
Okay. Cool. Question from Villax TV, another one along these lines, who asked, why haven't you made artifact knowledge account-wide? And I'm really glad that we got to this question because there's a lot of stuff that almost sort of is that in 715.
Well, I think the research compendiums we have in 715, I think pretty much are close to that.
Yeah.
They're a significant catch up. If you are knowledge level 20 on your main, you can just buy a 15 knowledge tome, mail it to your alts
for 1,000 order resources or something,
and slingshot them right there.
Yeah.
We just wanted to make it a bit more of an active process rather than hitting max level and having it automatically without taking any action to do it. And also, we wanted, if it's truly account wide, then it's something you only ever do on your main. As much as possible, we prefer catch up is great on alts. We don't want alts necessarily to have to do everything a main did.
Right.
But when you're playing another character, there should be some gameplay on that other character. There should be some reason to, when you're doing world quests on your alt, take those order resources, start your work orders, send your followers, send your champions out on missions, do all of those things, rather than just you only do it on your main and the other characters leech passively. So again, there's no philosophy here of wanting it to be grueling and having you make all the same efforts on your alts, but at the same time, we also shy from completely automatic, just account-wide parity.
Yeah, and there's another system as well that allows you, even if you don't necessarily have, I think it goes up to 10, maybe it's 15.
I think, and I think 15, and that's something we'd raise over the course of the expansion. That's a separate system. So the compendiums are for alt catch-up. The accelerated turn-ins are for actual new players, new characters, your first 110. If you get Legion for the holidays, you hit max level, you're way behind everybody in artifact knowledge. We definitely didn't want any sense of, you're being forcibly gated behind 45, 60 days worth of work orders before you could catch up to where most people are at. This way you can just go out, do some world quests, just turn those in repeatedly with no delay until you're largely caught up. And then you have the standard 3, 4, 5 day research once you get closer to where the pack is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people ended up missing out on the they didn't notice the compendiums going in because they saw the other one first. So it's good that we got a chance to explain the compendiums.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll definitely message in our actual release patch notes. I mean, there's plenty of experiments and things that make it in over the course of PTR that get discovered by data mining by a small portion of the community.
Right.
But the majority of players are not necessarily checking fan sites every day to see what the latest PTR build holds.
Right. Yeah.
So we tend to focus a lot of our messaging on official patch notes as things are closer to final, because even the artifact catch up went through a lot of different iterations before we settled on something that we're happy with.
Okay. Next question from Dilu is on a similar note, who said, are there any plans for making more things account-wide? I like the way the Artifact Research Compendium works, and it would be nice to have something like this for reputation. So, say, I'm now exalted with Nightfallen on my main.
Yeah.
I can send a care package to my alt that makes me revered or something.
I think that I think we definitely could do, and something we can look into, more spillover where more reputation sources at max level may become account bound and mailable, so you don't find yourself getting tokens when you're rep maxed that you can't do anything with. That said, I think what we did, our approach to reputation on an account-wide level, was making sure that some of the specific things that required rep were account-wide unlocked. So notably, the unlocking world quests, now account-wide.
Yeah.
Unlocking the Suramar dungeons, account-wide. Beyond that, if you have different trade skills on an alt than on a main, I think it's entirely appropriate that you need to go through the same steps to earn that reputation, because that's a goal that you're choosing to pursue because you want economic power, you want the rank 3 recipe so you can be efficient in crafting something for sale on the auction house. A lot of this is always about striking a balance between making alts accessible, making it feel like you don't have to go through too many hoops or too many grindy behaviors on all of your alts, but at the same time preserving gameplay and progression. I think we do strongly feel that alts shouldn't be there just to passively generate income. Alts should be characters that are played in their own right, that have their own goals and their own desires and their own rewards. And that's always the balance we're striking. Yeah,
and there's certainly a lot of people that make an alt because they want to PvP on a different character, or they want to do a raid on a different character. But there are a lot of people that make an alt because they want to get up their reputations. They want to do their trade skills differently as well. So it's important to keep a balance.
When you've run out of attainable short-term goals on your main character, you still like progressing. You still like filling bars. You still like getting more powerful items. All of those things. An alt is a way to do that again.
Okay. Question here from Bulkers, who asked, in 7.1 we have 3 to 5+ minute long loading screens, especially in Dalaran. When can we expect a fix? I know we've been working a lot on trying to resolve this issue. Do we have any sort of update on that?
Yeah, my latest understanding, we're actively working on it. It's a complex issue with a lot of conflicting information and multiple causes. If this were affecting everybody, it would probably be very easy to fix. But most people are probably a lot of people are probably reading this and they have no idea. They've never seen. They think of a long load screen as like 10 seconds. Clearly, multi-minute load screens. Something fundamentally wrong there. Whether it's a cache issue, a streaming issue, we're still nailing it down. Our engine team, BattleNet, and others are working through CS with affected players. It's a high priority for us. It's something we're actively investigating. I don't have any details to announce, but it's a high priority, and as soon as we can fix it, we're going to.
Yeah, there have been a lot of like attempts to fix this so far that clearly haven't at least affected everybody.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflicting information, right? Some people say turning off streaming options on your, Blizzard launcher will do it. Some people say deleting your cache will help, and for some people it does, but clearly for others it doesn't.
Yeah.
So, still working on it.
Okay. Question from Silent Hit, who asked, "What is your philosophy around legendary usability? Some legendaries require a specific situation to be useful at all, and therefore will often feel like they might not even be there in most situations." So, and I talked a little bit about this on the PTR forums the other day, just kind of the idea of maybe it's okay for a legendary to not always be at its max potential, but how do we feel about how that's working out?
Mixed feelings.
Okay.
I think it is okay. Clearly, there are a bunch of legendaries that fall into this category. Your Sephiroth's Secret won't do anything for you on Ursoc.
Right.
It will be amazing in other situations. Things that modify specific, if you're a legendary that makes your AoE better, also not great on Ursoc. So in the long run, also, as people get more legendaries, there will be this sort of mix and match toolkit approach to them, and that's something that the equip limit of 2 helps enforce. Months down the line, you'll be in a situation where you can, the way you might look at talents in some ways, pick the best legendary for a specific situation. Now, that said, I think one of the lessons we've learned, and this is a tricky problem to just solve in retrospect with regard to Legion legendaries, but it's definitely going to inform some of our future design here, and we're trying to help address it with tuning, is I think it may have been a mistake to make universally useful throughput legendaries. The mix of situational and non-situational legendaries is probably the biggest problem. That Sephiroth's isn't actually, there's nothing inherently terrible about it. In the world of, in Warcraft as a whole, over the course of years and expansions, an item that had those properties in a vacuum, if that was a standalone item, would have been exciting to most people. But what makes it not exciting is when you think, well, that could have been my pyro bracers.
Right.
Well, that could have been my rogue boots or whatever. And the fact that there are items in the pool that are universally always large throughput increases. It's never the wrong choice to wear the unholy bracers.
Right.
Ever. That's a problem. That if we could just take a couple of items out of the pool, which we can't really, we're not just going to delete items right now.
Yeah.
But if we could, and if you were choosing between Prydas, Sephiroth's, Portal Pants for Warlocks, Castball Moving Boots, other utility things, or situational damage things, like if there were a legendary that made your Chain Lightning jump an extra time. There are some situations in dungeons, in some AoE intensive raid encounters, where that would be a phenomenal item to equip. In others, it would be useless. That versus Prydas, well, that's actually kind of an even choice in a lot of ways. But a lot of what we're seeing and feeling and getting feedback on psychologically is that rather than being excited for the thing you got, you're upset and disappointed at the lack of the thing that it could have been.
Right.
And yeah, I think that the biggest culprits there are the 1 or 2 legendaries per spec, to the extent that they exist, that are just always useful. And so our mistake there was mixing universally useful things with situationally useful things.
Yeah.
But that's part of the ongoing tuning process. I think we're going to be tweaking downward those universally useful things. They're still good. You're not going to be unhappy to have the unholy bracers.
Sure.
But you also won't feel like you're not viable without them.
Okay. Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit earlier as well. Starting to get low on time here, so we can maybe only do 1 or 2 more questions. This one came from Leslie Chow, who asked, why are you guys opting to introduce important quality of life boosts to class designs via legendaries? For example, the Beast Mastery Shoulders.
I mean, this is no different than set bonuses or other things in the past. We're looking for things that are powerful and exciting that make you look at that and say, wow, I want to have that. Obviously, most things in that category players would love to have baked in as passive parts of their class, right? Most set bonuses over the years are things that you'd love to just have for free. Who wouldn't?
Right.
And in the long run, often that does happen. So it's also a chance to try out and learn from how something might modify gameplay. And if it just feels better overall, then maybe in a future iteration of our items and our classes, that is just a baseline property.
And to speak to intent on this a little bit, the goal is not, hey, we should make it so that like Beast Mastery Hunters have this new effect. Let's put it on a legendary. Like if it was something that was intended to be for absolutely everybody, then it wouldn't.
Exactly.
It wouldn't go there.
It's intended to be exciting, and it also gives us a more condensed, compact way of learning about it or learning from it.
Okay, cool. This will be our last question. Came from Einor88, who asked, any plan for a catch-up mechanic for the first 2 legendaries for alts?
I think over time, as the expansion goes on and more legendaries are introduced to the pool, we're going to continue increasing the drop rates of legendaries across the board. And so that will kind of be your catch-up mechanic effectively. Someone who picks up the game in 7.1.5, the person I just talked about who got it for the holidays, hit max level, they're much more likely to get their legendaries, and they'll get their legendaries much faster than people did who were starting in September. Because obviously, again, as time goes on, it increasingly becomes the norm to have a legendary, to have 2 legendaries, to have 3 legendaries, and the person who's a fresh character with 0 will need some in order to feel like they can be on the same playing field and be competitive with others.
Okay, cool. And maybe I'll finally get my second legendary as well, Ian.
Well, based on past history, you're probably going to get it tonight. Now that
Probably, yeah. Now that I've complained about it, I'll get it later. But anyway, that's gonna be it for today. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you so much for being here as well and doing another one of these.
A great time as always. I'm sorry I couldn't get to more questions, and I know if we didn't speak to your class's specific concerns. I promise we don't hate you. Like we don't hate any class, right? The whole like there's the common meme of like, well, Blizzard clearly hates warlocks or hates so and so or loves this class. We want everybody to be happy, right? At the end of the day, but if
we just hated warlocks, we'd just delete warlocks.
Pretty much. Contrary to what I said in this very room, a year and a half ago, we want you to play that spec. We want you to play that class.
We do want you to play Demonology.
Yeah. It's just we've over the course of years, we now are at a point with 36 different specializations. There's a lot of voices. There's a lot of concerns, and we can't speak to everybody at once. But we want to make sure that you do feel heard, that you do feel like your concerns are being addressed in something resembling a timely manner. And as Josh has talked about on the forums recently as well, we have work to do in improving our overall level of communication.
Yeah.
I think that with as many different conversations that need to happen, we can do a better job there, and we will.
Yeah, actively making changes to make sure that can happen for you guys. But again, we are completely out of time. So again, thanks so much, everybody. We're going to aim to do the next one of these sometime shortly after the holidays, maybe first couple of weeks of January. I don't have exact details yet on when that will be or what it will be about, etc. But yeah, that's good. That's our goal, is sometime shortly after the holidays is when the next one will be. So keep an eye out on the World of Warcraft website, on the Warcraft Twitter, etc.
Probably sometime around the release of patch 7.1.5, which spoilers is not coming before the holidays. We have a little bit more work to do there, and releasing a patch right before
everyone leaves,
exactly, is not ideal. So just if anyone's expecting it like next week, don't worry about it. That's not happening.
Okay, cool. Again, thanks so much, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Take care.